All right, let's dive into a real high-stakes corporate mystery. How do you predict that a massive company is about to collapse before it's too late?
I mean, you've seen the headlines, right? One day, a company looks like it's on top of the world, a total titan of industry. And then, bam, the next day, it's just gone. How in the world does that happen? And more importantly, why don't we ever seem to see it coming?
So, just how high are the stakes? Well, let's talk about one number, $63.1 billion. That was the estimated cost of just one single corporate failure, Enron. When a giant like that falls, the shockwaves are massive. They wipe out people's savings, their jobs, and they shatter trust in the entire market. And look, this wasn't just some freak accident with Enron. This happens all over the world. Over in Europe, you had the collapse of Parmalat, which left a $16 billion hole. In Australia, HIH Insurance went under with a shortfall of over $5 billion. This is a global, repeating, and incredibly expensive problem. So that brings us to the big question, the whole reason we're here today. This decades-long hunt for a reliable early warning system. Is there a way to find the clues, hidden deep inside a company's financial reports, before everything falls apart? For decades, the go-to tool for this investigation has always been financial ratios. Comparing things like a company's total debt to its total assets, or its cash flow to its liabilities. The hope has always been that some magic combination of these numbers could act like a smoke alarm for financial disaster. Okay, so for the longest time, the main method they used was something we'll call the static model. Think of it like our first detective on the case, using a method that's been around forever, but is actually deeply flawed. The whole idea behind the static model is pretty simple, actually. It's built on one giant assumption, that the warning signs of a collapse are always the same, and they never ever change. So in theory, the exact same financial red flags that pointed to trouble back in the 1980s should still work perfectly today. And that idea doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's based on this older school of thought called classical rational theory. And its big assumption is that people in business, especially the leaders, will always act in a perfectly logical and predictable way when they're faced with a problem. But here's the twist. This is where the whole case breaks wide open. What if the people running these huge companies don't actually behave like perfectly rational robots? What if the human element changes everything? And it turns out, that's it. That's the fatal flaw. Forgetting about human behavior is exactly why these old models just don't work. Because people, especially when they're under incredible pressure, don't always reason their way through a problem. A lot of the time, they just act on instinct and intuition. You've got this amazing insight from Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize winner, who basically said, hey, when people are under a ton of pressure, they don't always think things through logically. When the directors of a failing company are in full-on crisis mode, their choices are guided more by raw emotion, like the fear of getting caught, than by any kind of cold, hard logic. So what does this create? It creates this incredible high-stakes game of cat and mouse. You've got the company directors, the mice, trying to hide the problems, and on the other side, you have the regulators and the analysts, the cats, who are trying to find those exact problems. So let's walk through how this game actually works. Step 1, the company starts having some serious financial trouble. Step 2, the directors feel this immense pressure to hide it. So step 3, they start fudging the numbers. But which numbers? Well, intuitively, they mess with the numbers they think the regulators aren't looking at right now. And that, step 4, is what causes the warning signs to constantly change. So here's the absolute key takeaway, the most important thing to get. The warning signs, they're a moving target. The financial red flag that worked perfectly to predict a disaster yesterday might be totally useless today, simply because everyone learned to hide the problem somewhere else. And listen, this isn't just a theory. We've got the data to back it up. Take the 1980s. A review of these models found that one specific ratio, total liabilities to total assets, was a super popular and really effective predictor. The regulators were watching it like a hawk. But then, you jump forward to the 2000s and poof. Its power to predict anything had just vanished. It became almost useless. Why? Well, because the cat was watching that one spot, so the mice, the directors, just learned to move the cheese somewhere else. The game had changed. Okay, so if our first detective is always a step behind the culprit, it's time to bring in a new one. Let's talk about the dynamic model. So what's the big difference here? It's actually really straightforward. The static model is rigid. It assumes the rules never change, so it uses the same playbook forever. The dynamic model, on the other hand, is flexible. It knows the warning signs are always shifting, so it constantly updates its own rules for every new period of time it looks at. Right, so to put it another way, the dynamic model gets that it's a cat and mouse game. It knows the culprits are going to change their tactics over time, so it knows the detective has to change tactics too. It's that simple. All right, so this all sounds great in theory, but which model actually works in the real world? It's time for the final showdown. A study took a whole bunch of data on Australian companies, some that failed, some that didn't, and let both models have a crack at it. Okay, first up, let's look at our original detective, the static model. When they tested it, its accuracy was about 69%. You know, it's not awful, but that means it gets the prediction wrong almost 1/3 of the time. That's a lot of collapses you'd miss. And now, for the dynamic model. What was its score? A staggering 86.8%. That is a huge leap in accuracy. Think of the billions of dollars that could be saved with that kind of improvement. I mean, look at that. It's not even a competition. By simply accepting that human behavior creates a moving target, the dynamic model is just way, way better at sniffing out trouble. The case is solved. And that brings us to one last really important thought. We just saw how factoring in messy, unpredictable human behavior totally cracked the code in finance. So it makes you wonder, right? Where else, in economics, in public policy, in developing new tech, are we still using these old static models and completely forgetting about the most important variable of all, us?